Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones everyone underestimates. They walk among us wearing ordinary faces, carrying extraordinary secrets. They endure mockery, dismissal, and doubt while harboring skills that could save nations or topple governments. Sarah Chun knew this truth better than most, because for 23 years, she had been one of those people. Standing in the fluorescent-lit break room of Morrison accounting firm, listening to her coworkers snicker about her military fantasies, Sarah stirred her coffee with the same steady hand that had once guided sniper shots across impossible distances. They saw a quiet, unremarkable woman who claimed to have served overseas. They saw someone making up stories for attention. What they didn't see was the most lethal winter warfare specialist the U.S. military had ever produced. But secrets have a way of surfacing when you least expect them. And sometimes, all it takes is 3 words whispered by the right person to change everything. Winter, Siren lives. The story of how Sarah Chun went from being the office joke to commanding respect from a Navy SEAL colonel is more than just a tale of hidden identity. It's a story about the price of invisibility, the weight of unrecognized sacrifice, and the moment when the shadows finally step into the light. Because when your code name becomes legend, and your enemies still wake up screaming your alias 15 years later, there's no hiding forever. This is the true story of the woman they called Winter Siren, and the day her carefully constructed ordinary life came crashing down in the most extraordinary way. Sarah Chun had perfected the art of being invisible long before she learned how to kill silently in sub-zero temperatures. At Morrison accounting firm in downtown Seattle, she was just another face in the crowd of 40-something employees grinding through tax season. Her cubicle sat in the middle row, unremarkable except for the small American flag pin on her computer monitor and the complete absence of personal photographs. "There goes G.I. Jane again," whispered Marcus from the cubicle behind her as Sarah walked past carrying her thermos of black coffee. The comment drew snickers from the surrounding workstations. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she continued walking without acknowledging the remark. This had become the daily routine at Morrison. Ever since Sarah had mentioned her military service during her job interview 18 months ago, her coworkers had treated it like an elaborate fiction. The idea that this soft-spoken woman with her neat ponytail and conservative blouses had served in combat zones seemed absurd to them. She looked more like someone's elementary school teacher than a soldier. I heard she claimed she was in Afghanistan. Jennifer from HR had gossiped during a previous coffee break. Can you imagine? Her? In combat. The laughter that followed had echoed through the break room, like a cruel soundtrack to Sarah's lunch. What they didn't know was that Sarah Chun had spent 8 years in the Army, with 6 of those years in the most classified special operations unit that most people had never heard of. While they were attending college parties and building their social media presence, she had been learning 17 different ways to kill someone with improvised weapons. While they were complaining about cafeteria food, she had been eating field rations in -40-degree weather while tracking high-value targets across the mountains of Eastern Europe. The Winter Warfare Specialist program had recruited Sarah straight out of basic training after her instructors noticed her unusual combination of physical endurance, mental resilience, and absolute calm under pressure. What made her particularly valuable wasn't just her ability to survive in extreme cold weather conditions, but her capacity to thrive in them. Where other soldiers saw obstacles, Sarah saw opportunities. Her first deployment had been to northern Finland, where she spent 6 months learning advanced survival techniques from Norwegian Special Forces instructors. The training was designed to break people. Candidates were dropped into wilderness areas during the worst winter storms with minimal equipment and expected to not just survive, but complete complex mission objectives. Of the 24 soldiers who started the program, only 4 graduated. Sarah finished at the top of her class. From there, her assignments had taken her to some of the most dangerous and remote locations on the planet. She had spent 2 winters in the mountains along the Afghan-Pakistan border, where her job was to establish observation posts in impossible terrain and provide intelligence on Taliban supply routes. Her third deployment had been to Eastern Europe, where she had worked with NATO Special Forces to track weapons smugglers operating along the Russian border. But it was her final assignment that had earned her the code name that would follow her into civilian life. Operation Winter Storm had been classified at the highest levels, involving a 6-person team tasked with infiltrating a terrorist training camp deep in the Ural Mountains. The mission had gone wrong almost immediately when their helicopter was shot down 40 miles from the target. Sarah had been the only survivor. What followed was a 3-week ordeal that had become legend among special operations communities. Injured, alone, and hunted by enemy forces in hostile territory during one of the worst winters on record, Sarah had not only survived, but had managed to complete the primary mission objective. Using skills that seemed to blur the line between training and instinct, she tracked the enemy force back to their base, gathered critical intelligence, and eliminated several high-value targets before making her way to an extraction point over 200 miles away. The after-action reports from Operation Winter Storm had been so extraordinary that many senior officers initially refused to believe them. The idea that a single soldier could accomplish what Sarah had done seemed impossible. But the intelligence she had gathered led to the disruption of multiple terrorist cells, and satellite imagery confirmed her account of events. The enemy forces she had encountered during her escape had started calling her Winter Siren, because survivors reported hearing a woman's voice singing softly in the distance before their sentries disappeared one by one. By the time Sarah had recovered from her injuries, the intelligence community had taken notice. She received offers from several 3-letter agencies and private military contractors. The money being offered was substantial, and the work would have utilized her unique skill set. But Sarah had seen enough violence to last several lifetimes. She wanted nothing more than to disappear into the quiet normalcy of civilian life. The transition had been more difficult than she had anticipated. The first few months after her discharge, Sarah had struggled with nightmares and hypervigilance that made simple activities like grocery shopping feel like tactical exercises. She found herself unconsciously noting exit routes, potential weapons, and threat assessment in situations where the biggest danger was running out of her favorite coffee creamer. Therapy had helped, but what had saved her was the discovery that she could channel her need for precision and attention to detail into accounting work. Numbers didn't lie, betray, or try to kill you. They were predictable in ways that human beings never were. The methodical nature of financial analysis appealed to the part of her mind that had been trained to solve complex problems under pressure. Sarah had deliberately chosen Morrison Accounting because it was small enough to offer anonymity, but large enough to provide steady work. She had crafted a civilian identity that was truthful, but incomplete. Yes, she had served in the military. Yes, she had been deployed overseas. But she had learned to deflect specific questions and change the subject when conversations turned to details about her service. The strategy had worked perfectly until the day she had made the mistake of mentioning Afghanistan during casual conversation. Someone had overheard and shared the information, and gradually the story had grown into something unrecognizable. According to office gossip, Sarah claimed to have been everything from a helicopter pilot to a special forces operator. The more outrageous the rumors became, the more her coworkers seemed to enjoy mocking them. Did you hear she says she was a sniper? Marcus had announced during last week's team meeting, causing several people to burst into laughter. I bet she can't even handle the recoil from a paintball gun. Sarah had sat through these moments with the same expression she had worn while being interrogated during SEER training. She had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially when winning would require revealing more than she was willing to share. Her coworkers' mockery was irritating but harmless. They had no idea that the woman they were laughing at could have killed all of them before they realized what was happening. But maintaining that level of self-control was exhausting. Some days, Sarah felt like she was living 2 completely separate lives. There was Sarah Chan, the accountant, who worried about tax deadlines and office politics. And there was Winter Siren, who had once spent 4 days buried in a snow cave while enemy forces searched for her overhead, surviving on melted snow and emergency rations while planning her next move. The disconnect between these 2 identities had become more pronounced lately. Sarah found herself missing aspects of her military life that she had thought she was happy to leave behind. Not the violence or the danger, but the sense of purpose and the knowledge that her skills mattered. In the military, she had been part of something larger than herself. Her actions had consequences that extended far beyond her personal comfort or convenience. At Morrison Accounting, her most significant decisions involved whether to categorize certain expenses as business meals or entertainment. The work was honest and necessary, but it felt small in comparison to what she had done before. Sometimes, while reviewing someone's quarterly tax returns, Sarah would remember the weight of a rifle in her hands or the satisfaction of successfully completing a mission that had seemed impossible. These moments of nostalgia always made her feel guilty. She had chosen this life specifically because it was ordinary and safe. She had no right to complain about the peace she had worked so hard to find. But human nature was complicated, and the skills that had kept her alive in the world's most dangerous places didn't simply disappear because she was filling out tax forms instead of targeting enemy combatants. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had become invisible in civilian life using many of the same techniques she had used in the field. She dressed to blend in, avoided drawing attention to herself, and maintained operational security about her past. The difference was that in the military, being invisible had been a tactical advantage. In civilian life, it sometimes felt like a form of slow suffocation. Sarah's apartment reflected this same deliberate unremarkability. The furniture was functional, but not distinctive. The decorations were minimal and generic. There were no photographs from her military service, no souvenirs from her deployments, no visible reminders of the life she had lived before Morrison Accounting. To any casual observer, it would have appeared to belong to someone with no interesting history whatsoever. But hidden throughout the apartment were subtle indicators of Sarah's true background for anyone trained to notice them. The kitchen knives were professional grade and kept razor sharp. The locks on her doors were military specification. Her emergency supplies were stored with the kind of methodical organization that suggested extensive survival training. And buried in a waterproof container in her freezer, wrapped in plastic and hidden behind frozen vegetables, was a small collection of items that would have been impossible to explain to her coworkers. Inside the container was Sarah's medal collection, including the Silver Star she had received for Operation Winter Storm. There were also photographs from her military service showing a younger version of herself in combat gear, surrounded by teammates who had become family during their deployments. And at the bottom of the container, wrapped in cloth, was the K-bar knife that had been her constant companion during her final mission. Sarah hadn't looked at these items in over a year, but knowing they were there provided a strange comfort. They were proof that Winter Siren had been real, even if Sarah Chan was doing everything possible to make sure she stayed buried. These artifacts represented a life that had been dangerous and difficult, but had also been meaningful in ways that her current existence sometimes wasn't. As she sat in her cubicle that Tuesday afternoon in March, listening to her coworkers discuss their weekend plans and upcoming vacation trips, Sarah wondered if she would spend the rest of her life maintaining this careful balance between her two identities. Part of her hoped the answer was yes, because it would mean the world remained stable enough that Winter Siren would never be needed again. But another part of her, the part that had learned to trust instinct over logic during countless high-risk situations, suspected that her peaceful civilian life was more fragile than it appeared. Skills like hers were too rare and too valuable to remain hidden forever. Someone, somewhere, would eventually need what Winter Siren had to offer. Sarah just hadn't expected that day to arrive quite so soon, or in quite such a dramatic fashion. She definitely hadn't expected it to begin with a new employee orientation that would change everything. The first sign that Sarah's carefully constructed ordinary life was about to be disrupted came in the form of an email from HR announcing that Morrison Accounting had landed their largest client in company history. The Department of Veterans Affairs had selected them to handle financial consulting for several regional offices, and, as part of the contract, they would be working closely with a military liaison officer. Sarah read the announcement with the same mild interest she showed most office communications. Government contracts were good for business, which meant job security. The fact that she would potentially be working with military personnel was mildly ironic given her coworkers' attitude toward her supposed service, but she didn't expect it to create any significant complications. The liaison would likely be some desk officer from the administrative side of things, someone who had never seen combat, and wouldn't recognize the signs in someone else. She was completely wrong. Colonel James Mitchell arrived at Morrison Accounting on a Thursday morning in late March, and Sarah knew within 30 seconds of seeing him that her peaceful civilian life was in serious jeopardy. She recognized his type immediately. Career Special Operations, probably Navy SEALs based on his bearing and the way his eyes continuously scanned the room for potential threats. This wasn't someone who had spent his military career behind a desk. This was a warrior who had seen real action in dangerous places. Sarah watched from her cubicle as Jennifer from HR led Colonel Mitchell around the office, introducing him to various department heads and explaining Morrison's organizational structure. He was exactly what central casting would have ordered for a military officer: tall, broad-shouldered, with silver-gray hair and the kind of steady, assessing gaze that missed nothing. His civilian clothes were well-tailored but conservative, appropriate for a business environment while still somehow conveying authority and competence. When the tour reached Sarah's section of the office, she made a deliberate effort to appear busy with her computer screen. She had survived too many dangerous situations by knowing when to avoid attention, and every instinct she possessed was telling her that Colonel Mitchell represented a threat to the anonymity she had worked so hard to maintain. Unfortunately, her instincts proved correct. "This is our accounting department," Jennifer was explaining as the group approached Sarah's cubicle. "We've got some of our most experienced people working on the VA contract." She gestured towards Sarah's workstation. "Sarah Chin here will be handling the quarterly reconciliations for the regional offices." Sarah looked up with what she hoped was a politely professional expression and found herself making direct eye contact with Colonel Mitchell. For just a moment, something flickered across his face, a subtle shift in his expression that suggested recognition or at least suspicion. Then, his features returned to their previous neutrality, and he nodded politely. "Pleasure to meet you, Ms. Chun," he said, extending his hand for a brief handshake. His grip was firm, but not aggressive, exactly what she would have expected from someone with his background. But as their hands touched, Sarah felt him apply the slightest additional pressure with his index finger, a signal that she recognized immediately as military communication for "we need to talk." The rest of the introduction passed in a blur of polite conversation about the project timeline and deliverables. Colonel Mitchell asked appropriate questions about Morrison's procedures and capabilities while maintaining the demeanor of someone who was interested but not overly familiar with financial minutiae. To everyone else in the office, he appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be: a military liaison focused on ensuring smooth cooperation between the VA and their new civilian contractors. But Sarah knew better. She had spent enough time around special operations personnel to recognize when someone was conducting reconnaissance while appearing to make small talk. Colonel Mitchell was gathering intelligence, and she suspected that she was his primary target. After the tour ended and the group moved on to other parts of the office, Sarah found it difficult to concentrate on her work. She kept catching glimpses of Colonel Mitchell in her peripheral vision as he met with Morrison's senior management and reviewed contract documents. Several times, she noticed him glancing in her direction, though he was careful not to make obvious eye contact. The situation became more complicated during the lunch break. Sarah typically ate at her desk, while most of her coworkers went out to nearby restaurants or gathered in the break room. This routine had served her well for over a year, providing a peaceful hour of solitude in the middle of each workday. But on this particular Thursday, her quiet lunch was interrupted by a polite knock on her cubicle wall. "Ms. Chun." Colonel Mitchell stood at the entrance to her workspace, holding a cup of coffee and wearing an expression of casual friendliness. "I was hoping I could ask you a few questions about the VA project. Do you have a minute?" Sarah's mind immediately began calculating options. Refusing to talk would draw more attention than agreeing, but a conversation with someone of Mitchell's background posed obvious risks. She decided that her best strategy was to maintain her cover while trying to determine what he suspected and how much he actually knew. "Of course, Colonel," she replied, gesturing to the visitor chair beside her desk. "What can I help you with?" Mitchell sat down and spent a few moments organizing his papers, creating the appearance of someone preparing for a routine business discussion. But when he spoke, his words carried undertones that had nothing to do with accounting procedures. "I've reviewed your personnel file," he began conversationally. "I see that you have military experience. Army, if I'm reading correctly?" Sarah nodded carefully. "That's right. I served for 8 years before transitioning to civilian life." "Deployments overseas?" "Several," Sarah replied, keeping her voice neutral. "Nothing too exciting. Administrative support mostly." Colonel Mitchell smiled slightly, and Sarah realized immediately that she had made a tactical error. Someone with genuine administrative experience would have been more specific about their assignments and probably more enthusiastic about discussing them. Her vague deflection had actually provided more information than a detailed answer would have. "Administrative support," Mitchell repeated thoughtfully. "That's interesting, because I've been in the military for 26 years, and in my experience, people who described their service as nothing too exciting usually had the most interesting jobs of all. The conversation had clearly moved beyond casual workplace chit-chat, but Sarah wasn't sure how far Mitchell was willing to push things. She decided to continue with her cover story while being prepared to adapt if necessary. "I think most veterans feel that way," she said diplomatically. "Civilian life tends to make military service seem more dramatic than it actually was." Mitchell leaned back in his chair, studying her with the kind of intensity that made Sarah's combat instincts start to engage. She could feel her heart rate increasing slightly and had to consciously prevent herself from shifting into a more defensive posture. "You know," Mitchell said conversationally, "I've spent most of my career working with Special Operations Forces. SEALs, Rangers, Special Forces, some units that most people haven't heard of. And one thing I've learned is that you can usually tell within a few minutes of talking to someone whether they've actually been in combat." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the office air conditioning. "I'm not sure what you mean, Colonel." "Body language," Mitchell explained, his tone remaining friendly despite the increasingly serious nature of their conversation. "Situational awareness. The way someone positions themselves in a room, how they respond to unexpected sounds, dozens of little indicators that are invisible to most people, but obvious if you know what to look for." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee before continuing. "For example, when I walked up to your cubicle just now, you identified my approach while I was still 20 feet away. Most people don't notice someone coming until they're directly behind them. But you knew exactly where I was from the moment I entered this section of the office." Sarah realized that she was in serious trouble. Colonel Mitchell wasn't just suspicious. He was conducting what amounted to an interrogation disguised as casual conversation. Her options were becoming increasingly limited. She could continue with her cover story, but it was clearly inadequate against someone with his level of experience. She could attempt to end the conversation, but that would only confirm his suspicions. Or she could acknowledge the truth while trying to control how much information she revealed. "A lot of veterans develop heightened awareness," she said carefully. "It's a common adjustment issue when transitioning to civilian life." Mitchell nodded, as if this explanation made perfect sense. "True, but there are different levels of awareness. Someone who worked in administrative support might be a little more alert than the average person. But someone who tracked high-value targets across hostile terrain from multiple deployments." He shrugged. "That person would have awareness patterns that are considerably more sophisticated." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "Colonel, I think you may have me confused with someone else." "Doi." Mitchell's voice remained conversational, but his eyes had taken on the focused intensity of a predator who had cornered his prey. "Because I have to tell you, Ms. Chun, you're displaying some very interesting behavioral patterns for someone who claims to have spent their military career doing paperwork." The conversation was spiraling beyond Sarah's ability to control it, and she was beginning to realize that Colonel Mitchell knew far more than he was letting on. The question was how much he knew and what he intended to do with the information. "I'm not sure what kind of behavioral patterns you're referring to," Sarah said, though she suspected it was a futile attempt at maintaining her cover. Mitchell leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice so that their conversation would be inaudible to anyone more than a few feet away. "Well, for starters, you've maintained perfect situational awareness throughout this entire conversation. You know exactly where every other person in this office is located. You've identified at least 3 potential exit routes, and your body language suggests you're prepared to respond to a physical threat even though we're sitting in an accounting firm in downtown Seattle." Sarah felt her carefully constructed civilian identity beginning to crumble under Mitchell's methodical analysis. "Colonel, I think you're reading too much into, more importantly," Mitchell interrupted gently, "you have the specific type of hypervigilance that comes from extended exposure to asymmetric combat environments. Not the kind of general alertness that all veterans develop, but the particular awareness patterns that come from hunting human beings in their own territory." The accuracy of his assessment was so precise that Sarah wondered if Mitchell had somehow accessed or classified personnel records. But that seemed unlikely given the level of security clearance that would have been required. More probably, he was simply very good at reading people who had similar experiences to his own. "I'm sorry, Colonel, but I really don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said, though she could hear the lack of conviction in her own voice. Mitchell studied her for a long moment, then reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small notebook. He wrote something on one of the pages, tore it out, and placed it on Sarah's desk. "Ms. Chun," he said formally, "it's been a pleasure talking with you. I'm sure we'll have many opportunities to work together on the VA project. He stood up and extended his hand again for another brief handshake. If you ever want to continue our conversation, my direct number is on that paper. After Mitchell walked away, Sarah waited several minutes before looking at the note he had left. Written in neat handwriting were 10 digits that she assumed were his phone number. But below the numbers, in smaller letters, was something that made her blood run cold. Winter Siren. Sarah stared at the paper for what felt like several minutes, but was probably only seconds. She had been extremely careful never to mention her code name to anyone in civilian life. Even her therapist didn't know about Operation Winter Storm or the circumstances that had led to her receiving that particular designation. As far as she knew, the only people who were aware of the Winter Siren identity were senior military and intelligence officials with the highest security clearances, which meant that Colonel James Mitchell was far more than a simple military liaison officer. And her peaceful, anonymous life at Morrison Accounting had just become infinitely more complicated. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of distraction and growing anxiety. Sarah went through the motions of her regular work routine, while her mind raced through the implications of Mitchell's knowledge. How had he identified her? What did he want? And, most importantly, what was she going to do about it? By 5 o'clock, when the office began to empty out for the day, Sarah had reached a decision. She needed more information, and the only way to get it was to contact Colonel Mitchell directly. She waited until most of her coworkers had left, then used her cell phone to dial the number he had given her. He answered on the second ring. Colonel Mitchell. This is Sarah Chun, she said quietly. I think we need to finish our conversation. The coffee shop Colonel Mitchell had suggested was a 20-minute drive from Morrison Accounting, located in a quiet neighborhood that seemed designed for private conversations. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early and selected a corner table where she could observe the entire establishment while keeping her back to the wall. Old habits from her military training had proven impossible to break, even in the most innocent civilian situations. Mitchell arrived exactly on time, carrying a manila folder and wearing the same controlled expression he had maintained at the office. He ordered coffee from the counter, then joined Sarah at her table without any of the preliminary small talk that usually accompanied such meetings. I appreciate you calling, he began, settling into the chair across from her. I wasn't sure you would. I didn't have much choice, Sarah replied. You made it clear that you know things about my background that shouldn't be public knowledge. Mitchell nodded, opening the folder and withdrawing several documents. Before we go any further, I want you to understand that this conversation is completely off the record. Nothing we discuss here will appear in any official report or be shared with your current employer. Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of deception. What kind of assurances am I supposed to take from that? The kind that comes from the fact that I'm here unofficially, Mitchell said. The VA contract with Morrison Accounting is legitimate, and I am serving as the military liaison for that project. But my conversation with you today has nothing to do with government accounting procedures. He slid one of the documents across the table to Sarah. It was a military personnel file with her photograph and basic service information, but most of the details have been redacted with black markers. Only her name, rank, and years of service were clearly visible. Your official military records are surprisingly sparse, Mitchell observed. 8 years of service, multiple deployments, honorable discharge. But most of the specifics about your assignments and activities are classified at levels that require special authorization to access. Sarah glanced at the document without picking it up. Colonel, if you're expecting me to fill in the blanks, I'm not, Mitchell interrupted, because I already know what those blanks contain. He withdrew another document from the folder, this one bearing the letterhead of Naval Special Warfare Command. Sarah could see her photograph attached to what appeared to be an intelligence briefing, though the text was too small to read from across the table. 3 years ago, Mitchell continued, I was part of a joint task force investigating weapons trafficking networks in Eastern Europe. During our intelligence gathering phase, we came across references to a series of interdiction operations that had been conducted along the Russian border between 2019 and 2022. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but maintained her neutral expression. I don't see what that has to do with me. The operations were highly successful, Mitchell said, ignoring her deflection. Multiple high-value targets eliminated, significant weapons caches destroyed, intelligence gathered that led to the disruption of several international criminal organizations. But What made these operations particularly interesting was that they appeared to have been carried out by a single individual. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice despite the fact that the coffee shop was nearly empty. Someone with extraordinary winter warfare capabilities. Someone who could operate independently in hostile territory for extended periods. Someone the local criminal networks had started calling Winter Siren. Sarah remained silent, but she could feel the walls of her carefully constructed civilian life beginning to crumble around her. She had always known that her military service might eventually catch up with her, but she had hoped for more time to establish her new identity. The intelligence reports were fascinating reading, Mitchell continued, particularly the after-action analysis of Operation Winter Storm. Sole survivor of a helicopter crash, completed the primary mission objective despite being injured and hunted by enemy forces, eliminated multiple high-value targets while conducting a running extraction across over 200 miles of hostile territory. He paused, studying Sarah's face for any reaction. The analysts who wrote those reports described Winter Siren as possibly the most effective individual operator they had ever encountered. Someone with skills that bordered on the supernatural. "Colonel," Sarah said quietly, "even if I was the person you're talking about, which I'm not confirming, I don't understand why you're here. My military service ended over 2 years ago. I moved on with my life." Mitchell's expression grew more serious. Because Winter Siren's enemies haven't moved on with theirs. The statement hung in the air between them like a physical threat. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized that this conversation wasn't just about her past. It was about her present and possibly her future. "What do you mean?" she asked, though she suspected she didn't want to hear the answer. Mitchell withdrew another document from his folder, this one bearing the seal of the Defense Intelligence Agency. 6 months ago, intelligence sources in Eastern Europe began reporting increased activity from the criminal organizations that Winter Siren had targeted during her operational period. Specifically, they appear to be actively seeking information about her identity and current location. Sarah's mind immediately began calculating threat assessments and response options. How actively? They've put a substantial bounty on any information leading to Winter Siren's real name or whereabouts, Mitchell replied. Enough money to make it worthwhile for serious people to start investigating. The implications of this revelation were staggering. Sarah had been careful to maintain operational security when transitioning to civilian life, but she wasn't naive enough to believe that her identity could remain hidden indefinitely if determined adversaries were actively searching for her. "How do you know all this?" she asked. "Because 3 weeks ago, one of those criminal organizations made contact with someone who had access to classified U.S. military personnel records," Mitchell explained. They specifically requested information about female soldiers who had served in winter warfare operations in Eastern Europe between 2019 and 2022. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the coffee shop's air conditioning. And the contact was intercepted by NSA surveillance programs before any information could be transferred, Mitchell said. But it confirmed that Winter Siren's enemies are getting closer to identifying her. It also triggered a series of security protocols designed to protect personnel whose covers might be compromised. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a business card, placing on the table between them. "Which brings me to why I'm here." Sarah glanced at the card. Instead of military contact information, it bore the logo and information for a private security consulting firm based in Virginia. "I've been tasked with locating Winter Siren and offering her a choice," Mitchell explained. "She can accept protection and relocation assistance while intelligence agencies work to neutralize the threat against her. Or she can return to operational status and help eliminate the problem at its source." The coffee shop suddenly felt impossibly small and exposed. Sarah found herself unconsciously cataloging exit routes and potential weapons while trying to process the magnitude of what Mitchell was telling her. "You're offering me a job," she said slowly. "I'm offering you options," Mitchell corrected. "The people looking for Winter Siren aren't going to give up. They have significant resources and highly motivated reasons to find her. Your current cover identity won't protect you indefinitely." Sarah stared at the business card while her mind raced through the implications. She had worked so hard to build a normal life, to put the violence and danger of her military career behind her. The thought of returning to that world was both terrifying and, if she was honest with herself, somewhat appealing. "What kind of operational status are we talking about?" she asked quietly. Consulting work initially, Mitchell replied. Help identify the key players in these criminal organizations, provide intelligence about their capabilities and potential tactics. Eventually, if the situation escalates, more direct involvement might be necessary. Sarah looked up from the car to meet Mitchell's eyes. And if I choose protection and relocation instead? New identity, new location, financial support while you establish yourself in a new career, Mitchell said. But no guarantees about long-term security. These people are patient and well-funded. They might eventually find you anyway. The choice Mitchell was offering wasn't really a choice at all. Sarah could run and hope that her enemies would eventually give up, or she could stand and fight using the skills that had made her legendary in the first place. When framed that way, the decision was surprisingly easy. How much time do I have to decide? She asked. The threat assessment suggests that your current location might be compromised within the next few weeks, Mitchell replied. So not long. Sarah nodded, picking up the business card and tucking it into her pocket. I need to think about this. Of course, Mitchell said, closing his folder. But, Ms. Chun, or whoever you really are, I want you to understand something. The people looking for Winter Siren aren't interested in capturing her alive. They want revenge for what she did to their organizations, and they want to send a message to anyone else who might consider similar operations. He stood up, extending his hand for what Sarah suspected might be their final handshake as relative strangers. Winter Siren was created to solve problems that conventional military forces couldn't handle. Right now, she's facing a problem that her civilian identity definitely can't handle. After Mitchell left the coffee shop, Sarah sat alone for nearly an hour, staring at her untouched coffee while trying to come to terms with a fundamental shift that had just occurred in her life. For over 2 years, she had been successful in maintaining the fiction that Winter Siren was a chapter from her past that could remain permanently closed. But the reality was that some things could never be completely left behind. Her enemies had found her trail, which meant that her peaceful life at Morrison Accounting was essentially over. She could continue pretending to be a normal accountant for a few more weeks or months, but eventually the people hunting Winter Siren would narrow their search enough to identify Sarah Chun. When that happened, her coworkers and neighbors would become potential collateral damage in a conflict they knew nothing about. The drive back to her apartment gave Sarah time to consider her options more carefully. Mitchell had presented the choice as either accepting protection or returning to operational status, but there was a third possibility he hadn't mentioned. She could disappear on her own terms, using skills and resources that no government agency knew about. It would mean abandoning everything she had built in Seattle, but it would also mean maintaining control over her own security. But as Sarah pulled into her apartment complex parking garage, she realized that even this option might already be compromised. Her heightened awareness, dormant for over 2 years, was suddenly operating at full capacity again. And what she was noticing made her blood run cold. There was a van parked across the street from her building that hadn't been there when she left for her meeting with Mitchell. The vehicle's windows were tinted, and it was positioned to provide a clear view of the building's main entrance. More concerning was the fact that she could see the glow of electronic equipment through the windshield, suggesting surveillance gear. Sarah sat in her car for several minutes, observing the van while considering her response options. The smart thing to do would be to drive away immediately and contact Mitchell for emergency extraction. But all of her personal belongings were in her apartment, including the items hidden in her freezer that represented her only tangible connection to her military service. More importantly, running away without knowing who was watching her or how much they knew would mean spending the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. Winter Siren had been trained to engage threats directly, not to run from them. Sarah started her car and drove past her building without stopping, circling the block to approach from a different angle. She parked 3 blocks away and made her way back on foot, using alleyways and building shadows to avoid being seen from the van's position. Getting into her building undetected required skills she hadn't used since her military service, but the techniques came back as if she had practiced them yesterday. Sarah used the emergency stairwell to reach her floor, then carefully approach her apartment door while listening for any sounds that might indicate it had been compromised. The apartment appeared to be undisturbed, but Sarah's instincts told her that appearances could be deceiving. She spent several minutes conducting a careful search for surveillance devices or signs of unauthorized entry before retrieving the items from her freezer. As she held her Silver Star medal and looked at the photographs from her military service, Sarah realized that the decision Mitchell had asked her to make had already been made for her. The people hunting Winter Siren had found her, which meant that Sarah Chen's peaceful civilian life was over. The only question now was whether Winter Siren would go quietly into hiding, or whether she would remind her enemies why they had been afraid to speak her name above a whisper. Sarah didn't sleep that night. Instead, she spent the dark hours systematically preparing for what she suspected would be the end of her life as a civilian accountant. She packed a single go bag with essential items, arranged for the automatic payment of her bills for the next several months, and composed a resignation letter that would take effect in 2 weeks. Most importantly, she retrieved her K-bar knife from its hiding place and secured it in a concealed carry position that would be accessible but invisible under her business attire. When she arrived at Morrison Accounting the next morning, Sarah was functioning in a state of controlled alertness that she hadn't experienced since her final deployment. Every sound seemed amplified. Every movement in her peripheral vision demanded assessment, and her mind automatically cataloged potential weapons and defensive positions throughout the office space. The surveillance van had been gone when she left her apartment, but Sarah wasn't naive enough to believe that meant the threat had disappeared. Professional surveillance teams rarely maintained obvious static positions for extended periods. More likely, her watchers had either gathered the information they needed or had moved to a more sophisticated observation method. "You look tired," Jennifer from HR commented as Sarah settled into her cubicle. "Everything okay? Just didn't sleep well," Sarah replied, maintaining the pleasant but unremarkable demeanor that had served her so effectively for the past 2 years. "I'll be fine once I get some coffee." But coffee wasn't going to solve her current problem. Sarah was walking a dangerous line between maintaining her civilian cover and preparing for the possibility that her true identity might be revealed in dramatic fashion. She had contacted Colonel Mitchell before leaving her apartment, leaving a voicemail that simply said she was ready to discuss their conversation further. But she hadn't heard back yet, and she was beginning to wonder if she was running out of time to make a controlled transition. The morning passed quietly, with Sarah going through the motions of her regular work routine while actually conducting surveillance of her own workplace. She noted the positions of her co-workers, identified which ones would be most likely to panic in an emergency situation, and planned evacuation routes that would minimize civilian casualties if violence erupted inside the office. It was an exhausting mental exercise that reminded her why she had been so eager to leave the military. Living in a constant state of tactical readiness was psychologically draining, and she had hoped never to experience it again. But circumstances had conspired to drag Winter Siren back to the surface, and with her came all the hypervigilance and threat assessment protocols that had kept Sarah alive in the world's most dangerous places. Around 11 o'clock, Sarah's careful monitoring of the office environment paid off when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Marcus, the co-worker who had been most vocal about mocking her supposed military service, was engaged in a hushed conversation near the copy machine with someone Sarah had never seen before. The stranger was a thin man in his 30s wearing an expensive suit that didn't quite fit his body type correctly. More concerning was the fact that he was asking questions about Sarah while pretending to be interested in the company's services. Sarah couldn't hear the specific words from her cubicle, but she could read body language well enough to understand the general nature of their discussion. Marcus was pointing in Sarah's direction and providing what appeared to be detailed information about her work schedule, her habits, and her background. The stranger was taking notes in a small notebook and nodding encouragingly. To anyone else in the office, it would have looked like a potential client making casual conversation with an employee. But Sarah recognized it as an intelligence-gathering operation. Her enemies had found her. Sarah forced herself to continue working normally while her mind raced through response options. She could attempt to leave the building immediately, but that might trigger a confrontation in an environment filled with innocent civilians. She could try to contact Colonel Mitchell for emergency extraction, but she suspected that help would arrive too late to prevent whatever was about to happen. Or she could stay and deal with the threat directly, using skills that her co-workers had been mocking for over a year. The decision was made for her when the stranger finished his conversation with Marcus and began walking in the direction of Sarah's cubicle. She could see him in her peripheral vision, moving with the controlled gait of someone who was trying to appear casual while actually preparing for potential violence. His right hand was positioned near his jacket pocket in a way that suggested he was carrying a concealed weapon. Sarah continued typing on her computer while mentally preparing for combat. The knife secured beneath her jacket was easily accessible, but using it would require getting close enough to the stranger to neutralize him before he could draw whatever weapon he was carrying. More problematically, any violence in the middle of the office would immediately expose her true identity to her coworkers and potentially put them in danger. Ms. Chun. The stranger had reached her cubicle and was standing at the entrance to her workspace, just beyond arm's reach. His voice carried a slight accent that Sarah couldn't immediately identify, but his English was fluent and professionally polite. "I was hoping I could speak with you for a moment." Sarah looked up from her computer with an expression of mild curiosity. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" "Not yet," the stranger replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But I believe we have some mutual acquaintances who are very interested in meeting you." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah's mind immediately began calculating distances, angles of attack, and potential collateral damage scenarios. She was acutely aware that Jennifer from HR was sitting less than 10 feet away, completely oblivious to the danger, and that Marcus was still standing near the copy machine where he could be caught in crossfire if the situation escalated. "I'm not sure what you mean," Sarah said, maintaining her cover while shifting slightly in her chair to improve her position for a rapid response. "Are you a client of the firm?" "In a manner of speaking," the stranger replied. He moved closer to her desk, ostensibly to speak more quietly, but Sarah recognized the action as a tactical advance. "I represent some people who have been looking for someone with your particular background for quite some time." Sarah's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the concealed knife, but she forced herself to maintain the appearance of confusion. "I think you have me confused with someone else." The stranger's smile widened, and Sarah could see genuine amusement in his eyes. "Ms. Chun, or should I say Winter Siren, I don't think either of us needs to continue this charade. My employers know exactly who you are and what you've done. The only question is whether you're going to come with me quietly or whether we're going to have a more dramatic conversation." The use of her code name in the middle of Morrison Accounting's office space created a moment of surreal disconnection for Sarah. After 2 years of carefully maintaining her civilian identity, hearing Winter Siren spoken aloud in her workplace felt like two separate worlds colliding in the most violent way possible. But, more importantly, the stranger's casual mention of her code name confirmed that her enemies had indeed found her and were prepared to act on that information. The time for maintaining her cover was over. "I'm sorry," Sarah said loudly enough for her voice to carry to the surrounding cubicles, "but I'm going to have to ask you to leave. I don't know what you're talking about, and I'm not interested in whatever you're selling." The response was calculated to draw the attention of her coworkers while establishing a public record of her attempts to de-escalate the situation. Sarah could see Jennifer from HR looking in their direction with an expression of concern, and Marcus had stopped his conversation near the copy machine to observe what was happening. The stranger's expression hardened as he realized that Sarah wasn't going to cooperate quietly. "Ms. Chun, I don't think you understand the seriousness of your situation. My employers are not people who accept disappointment gracefully." "Security," Sarah called out, though she knew Morrison Accounting didn't have any security personnel beyond the standard building guards. "I need someone to escort this gentleman out of the building." But even as she spoke, Sarah could see the stranger's right hand moving toward his jacket pocket with the fluid motion of someone preparing to draw a weapon. The situation was about to escalate beyond her ability to control it through words alone. What happened next occurred so quickly that most witnesses would later struggle to provide coherent accounts of the sequence of events. The stranger's hand emerged from his jacket holding what appeared to be a small pistol. But before he could bring it fully to bear, Sarah moved with the speed and precision that had made Winter Siren legendary among special operations communities. She rose from her chair while simultaneously drawing her knife, closing the distance between herself and the stranger in a single fluid motion that brought her inside his weapon's effective range before he could complete his draw. Her left hand secured his gun arm while her right pressed the knife's point against his throat with just enough pressure to break the skin. "Drop it," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a tone of absolute authority that none of her co-workers had ever heard from her before. The stranger's eyes widened as he realized that his intelligence about Sarah Chun the accountant had been fatally incomplete. He was face to face with Winter Siren, and she was demonstrating exactly why that name had become whispered legend among the criminal organizations of Eastern Europe. The pistol clattered to the floor as the stranger released it, but Sarah maintained her grip on his arm and the pressure of the knife against his throat. Around them, the office had erupted into chaos as employees realized what was happening and began screaming, diving under desks, and rushing toward exits. "Everyone out!" Sarah shouted without taking her eyes off her captive. "Call 911 and evacuate the building immediately." Jennifer from HR was staring at the scene with an expression of complete shock. "Sarah, what's happening? Who is this person?" "Just get everyone out," Sarah replied. "Now." As her coworkers scrambled to follow her instructions, Sarah heard a familiar voice behind her. "I was wondering when Winter Siren was going to make her appearance." She turned her head slightly and saw Colonel Mitchell standing near the elevator bank, flanked by two men in tactical gear who were obviously military or law enforcement. His expression was grim, but unsurprised, suggesting that he had been expecting something like this to happen. "You're late," Sarah said, maintaining her control of the stranger while acknowledging Mitchell's arrival. "Traffic," Mitchell replied dryly. "But it looks like you have the situation well in hand." The stranger Sarah was holding began speaking rapidly in a language she didn't recognize, apparently trying to communicate with someone through a concealed radio device. Sarah increased the pressure of the knife against his throat, and he immediately fell silent. "How many more?" Mitchell asked, approaching with his weapon drawn, but not directly threatening Sarah's captive. "Unknown," Sarah replied. This one was gathering intelligence, but there could be backup positioned outside the building. As if summoned by her words, the sound of gunfire erupted from the street below, followed by shouting and the unmistakable noise of tactical vehicles moving into position. Through the office windows, Sarah could see black SUVs surrounding the building while figures in military gear established a perimeter. "Well," Mitchell observed, "I'd say your civilian cover is officially blown." Sarah looked around the now-empty office space where she had spent the last 2 years trying to build a normal life. Her co-workers' personal belongings were scattered across their desks, abandoned in their rush to escape. Coffee cups sat cooling beside half-finished reports. Family photographs smiled from cubicle walls, reminders of the innocent civilian world that Winter Siren had never quite managed to inhabit. "Yeah," Sarah agreed, transferring her captive to Mitchell's custody while keeping her knife readily accessible. "I think Sarah Chin's career in accounting is over." Through the windows, she could see news vans beginning to arrive, drawn by the sounds of gunfire and the obvious law enforcement response. By evening, the story of whatever had happened at Morrison Accounting would be broadcast across multiple media outlets. Her carefully maintained anonymity was about to become very public exposure. But as Sarah watched Mitchell's team secure her would-be kidnapper and coordinate with the tactical units outside, she realized that she felt something she hadn't experienced in over 2 years, a sense of purpose that went beyond balancing quarterly reports and filing tax returns. Winter Siren was back, and her enemies had just learned that finding her was much easier than capturing her. The war they had been planning to bring to her doorstep was about to become their worst nightmare. The FBI debrief took 18 hours and occurred in a secure facility that Sarah suspected was nowhere near Seattle, though the lack of windows made it impossible to confirm her location. She sat across from a conference table populated by representatives from agencies whose acronyms she recognized, but whose specific roles in the current situation remained unclear. Colonel Mitchell was present, but he had transitioned from friendly recruiter to professional colleague, maintaining the appropriate distance for someone who had essentially been proven right about the necessity of their earlier conversation. The stranger Sarah had captured at Morrison Accounting had turned out to be a mid-level operative working for the Volkov organization, a criminal network that had been one of Winter Siren's primary targets during her final deployment. Under interrogation, he had revealed the existence of a substantial bounty on Winter Siren's head, along with a sophisticated intelligence operation that had been tracking former U.S. military personnel who matched her operational profile. "The good news," explained Agent Davidson from the FBI's Counterterrorism Division, "is that your quick response prevented them from successfully kidnapping you. The bad news is that your civilian identity is now completely compromised, along with your location and probably your entire background since leaving the military." Sarah nodded, accepting coffee from one of the junior agents while reviewing the intelligence reports spread across the conference table. The scope of the Volkov organization's search for her was both impressive and deeply concerning. They had dedicated significant resources to identifying Winter Siren, including the recruitment of sources within various government agencies and private sector organizations that employed former military personnel. How did they narrow it down to Morrison accounting? Sarah asked. Process of elimination combined with some sophisticated data analysis, replied Agent Martinez from the NSA. They started with Department of Defense personnel records for female soldiers who served in winter warfare specialties between 2019 and 2022. Then they cross-referenced that data with employment records, tax filings, and social media presence to identify candidates who had transitioned to civilian life in the Pacific Northwest. Sarah felt a chill as she realized how thoroughly her enemies had penetrated her carefully constructed new life. They had access to tax filings. The source they cultivated in the IRS has been arrested, Agent Davidson assured her. But, yes, they were able to access enough financial records to identify several potential candidates, including Sarah Chun. Colonel Mitchell leaned forward, adding his own assessment to the briefing. What made you a priority target was the combination of your financial profile and your employment history. Most former Special Operations personnel who transition to civilian careers either stay in security-related fields or start their own businesses. The fact that you became an accountant at a small firm was unusual enough to draw attention. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that her attempt to blend into the most ordinary civilian career possible had actually made her more conspicuous to people who understood military personnel psychology. So what happens now? That depends on what you want to happen, Agent Davidson replied. We can provide you with a new identity and relocation assistance. Full witness protection with ongoing security monitoring until we're confident the threat has been neutralized. Sarah considered the offer while studying the intelligence reports. The Volkov organization had extensive international connections and significant financial resources. Even if the immediate threat was contained, there would always be the possibility that they might resume their search using different methods or recruit new sources within government agencies. What's the alternative? She asked, though she suspected she knew what the answer would be. Colonel Michel Answert. Help us eliminate the threat at its source. The Volkov organization has been a target of international law enforcement for years, but they've been careful to insulate their leadership from direct prosecution. Someone with your particular skill set could provide access that conventional law enforcement can't achieve. You're asking me to go back to work, Sarah said. I'm asking Winter Siren to finish what she started, Mitchell replied. These people put a bounty on your head because you disrupted their operations so effectively that they couldn't rebuild their networks. But instead of learning to leave you alone, they've decided to escalate the conflict. Sarah looked around the conference room at the assembled representatives of various agencies, all of whom were waiting for her response to an offer she had never expected to receive. 2 days ago, her biggest concern had been preparing quarterly tax reports. Now she was being recruited to conduct what amounted to a targeted assassination campaign against international criminals who wanted her dead. The smart choice would be to accept witness protection and disappear into a new civilian identity somewhere far from Seattle. She could spend the rest of her life as someone completely different, safe from the enemies that Winter Siren had made during her military service. It was the rational response to a situation that had spiraled beyond her control. But rationality had never been Winter Siren's strongest characteristic. What kind of operational parameters are we talking about? Sarah asked. Agent Davidson opened another folder and withdrew a series of photographs showing various individuals in different locations. The Volkov organization is structured around 3 key figures who coordinate operations from bases in Moldova, Montenegro, and northern Finland. Traditional law enforcement can't touch them because they operate in regions where local authorities are either corrupted or intimidated. Sarah studied the photographs while her mind automatically began developing tactical assessments. Intelligence support, full NSA and CIA resources, Agent Martinez confirmed. Real-time satellite surveillance, communications intercepts, detailed background intelligence on all potential targets, and their security arrangements. Extraction protocols? Whatever you need, Colonel Mitchell said. This operation would have the highest priority designation and unlimited resources. Sarah continued reviewing the intelligence materials while considering the implications of returning to operational status. The people in the photographs were dangerous criminals who had caused substantial harm to both military personnel and innocent civilians. They had declared war on Winter Siren by putting a bounty on her head, and their actions at Morrison Accounting had endangered people who had no connection to the conflict. But, more importantly, Sarah realized that she had been lying to herself about her satisfaction with civilian life. The past 2 years had been peaceful and safe, but they had also been empty in ways that she had tried hard to ignore. She had been using accounting work as an escape from the violence and moral complexity of her military career, but escape wasn't the same as fulfillment. Timeline, she asked. The longer we wait, the more time they have to improve their security or identify alternative targets, Agent Davidson replied. We'd like to begin operations within the next 2 weeks. Sarah closed the intelligence folders and looked directly at Colonel Mitchell. What happens afterward? Assuming the operations are successful and the threat is eliminated? That's up to you, Mitchell said. You could return to civilian life with a new identity and the knowledge that your enemies are no longer a factor. Or you could consider more permanent consulting work with various agencies that could benefit from your expertise. The choice between safety and purpose was one that Sarah had been avoiding for over 2 years, but circumstances had made further avoidance impossible. She could continue running from Winter Siren's enemies and the aspects of herself that they represented, or she could embrace the reality that some problems could only be solved through the precise application of control violence. I need to make some phone calls, Sarah said. Agent Davidson nodded. Of course. Take whatever time you need to consider. I'm not reconsidering, Sarah interrupted. I'm accepting the assignment. But I need to make arrangements for some people who might be affected by my decision. The first call was to Morrison Accounting's main number. Jennifer from HR answered, and Sarah could hear the stress in her voice as she explained that the office was closed indefinitely while FBI investigators processed the scene. Sarah, thank God you're okay, Jennifer said when Sarah identified herself. We've been so worried. Nobody knew what happened to you after that man showed up. Are you hurt? Where are you? I'm fine, Sarah replied, though she knew that wasn't entirely true. Jennifer, I need you to know that I'm resigning from my position at Morrison, effective immediately. I won't be coming back to the office. But, Sarah, you don't have to quit because of what happened. Mr. Morrison says we're all going to get counseling and security will be improved before we reopen. That man who attacked you is in custody. Sarah felt a pang of guilt as she realized how her coworkers were trying to process events that made no sense within their civilian understanding of the world. They had no context for understanding why someone would want to kidnap their quiet accountant colleague, so they were interpreting it as a random act of workplace violence. It's not about that, Sarah said gently. There are things about my background that I never told anyone at the firm. Things that made yesterday's incident my responsibility rather than just bad luck. I don't understand, Jennifer replied, confusion evident in her voice. You don't need to understand, Sarah said. But I need you to know that everyone at Morrison is safe now. The threat was specifically directed at me. And since I'm leaving, there's no reason for anyone to be concerned about further incidents. After ending the call, Sarah sat quietly for several minutes thinking about the co-workers she was leaving behind. They would probably never understand what had really happened in their office, which was probably better for everyone involved. They could return to their normal lives of tax preparation and client meetings, while Winter Siren returned to the considerably more dangerous work of eliminating international criminals. The second call was to her landlord, explaining that she would need to terminate her lease immediately due to unexpected circumstances. The third call was to her bank, arranging for the closure of her civilian accounts and the transfer of her savings to a secure government facility where it could be held during her operational period. Each call felt like another step away from the life she had built as Sarah Chun and toward the resumption of her identity as Winter Siren. It was a transition that felt both terrifying and inevitable, like stepping off a cliff while knowing that her parachute would probably deploy correctly. When she had finished making her arrangements, Sarah returned to the conference room where the agency representatives were waiting with mission briefings and operational planning materials. Colonel Mitchell looked up as she entered, and she could see acknowledgement in his expression that suggested he had never doubted what her decision would be. Welcome back to the war, Winter Siren, he said simply. As Sarah settled back in her chair and began reviewing target intelligence, she realized that her coworkers at Morrison Accounting had been wrong about one thing. She hadn't been making up stories about her military service. She had been telling the truth, just not the complete truth. But now, for the first time in over 2 years, Winter Siren was free to tell her story in its entirety. And her enemies were about to discover that some stories ended with everyone learning exactly why certain names should never be spoken above a whisper. The woman they had been hunting was coming for them, and this time she wasn't planning to disappear when the mission was complete. This time, she was going to make sure that the people who threatened innocent civilians learned to regret every decision that had led them to put a price on Winter Siren's head. The hunt was about to become a war, and wars were something that Winter Siren had always been exceptionally good at winning.